Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The most recent jobs report from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that the unemployment rate jumped to 14.7%, possibly putting the U.S. in the deepest recession since the Great Depression. The report also shows a staggering loss of 20.5 million jobs. That's the largest monthly loss in recorded history. If this crisis that we're in right now is similar to those in the past, we can expect it to have a long-lasting impact on the economy and business. While many businesses obviously are currently reopening or will eventually reopen, and millions will return to the workplace, what will the ongoing recovery look like? And how long will it take? Ultimately, what will the lasting impacts be on your workplace? Well, that's what we're looking at today. Hopefully, it's obvious why you care, since most of you listening are probably in the workforce. This ultimately impacts you, whether you're still employed or not. This and how COVID-19 has materialized will have a lasting impact if past recessions are any indication. But of course, even if you're not in the workforce, it impacts you because how the people in the workforce are doing impacts your ability to get the goods and services that you're after. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on the workplace and the economy without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Everybody's been affected by this in the workplace, and whether it's you personally or family members or your household, we all know people who have been affected by this. A lot of information here to feed, and I'll feed you a little bit when I'm allowed. But there are some interesting statistics when you look at where the jobs were lost. You know, you talked about almost 21 million jobs, and as well as then what are we going to do? What's the workplace going to look like in the future?
In a first of its kind report from the Conference Board in New York, they have a report that basically answers that very question. It's entitled From Immediate Responses to Planning for the Reimagined Workplace: Human Capital Responses to the COVID-19 Pandemic. And this report, Lance, part of the reason it's significant, right, is this is really the first one that's been done by a major institution since all this took place to really gauge the specific long-term ramifications of the workplace. But also it's significant as well because the Conference Board, we were told, right, Lance, that they basically put this together in about a month's time. They
ran the survey for about 2 weeks and then took about a week or so to compile everything and get the report out. And we also have the government, right, the government's report. We're going to talk a little bit about that here in segment 1 about the job report.
These are both things you can directly access. So thestateofus.org, Lance is going to go into here some of the highlights of the jobs report from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. And then in the second segment, that's when we'll talk about the Conference Board report, which is actually also free to access right now as well. So especially if you're an employer, even if you're an employee, these might be things that you want to take a look at directly, but hopefully we'll break it down for you all pretty well today. So Lance, what were some of the things that you saw here that you were taking away that are important for people to understand about those big numbers I shared? 20.5 million jobs lost, largest monthly loss in recorded history, right?
The two big takeaways I had were that almost half of those jobs, of the 20.5 million jobs, were in leisure and hospitality and retail. Leisure and hospitality had a loss of 7.7 million jobs. And interestingly enough, as we could all imagine, 5.5 or almost between 70 and 75% of those jobs were in food services and drinking places. So that was a little bit of eye catching there when you talk about 20.5 million jobs overall. A third were in leisure and hospitality. And of those that were in leisure and hospitality, almost 3/4 of those were in food services and drinking places. The other big one were in retail. Retail dropped 2.1 million jobs. And actually, they almost dropped 2.2 million jobs because an interesting side note in retail, there were 93,000 new jobs created in April.
Response to increased online ordering, right?
Right. But those two That was the big takeaways for me, because that took up almost half the jobs were in hospitality and retail. So when we talk about, I'm just thinking, watching TV or listening to the radio and the commercials, those are the two that we hear about, that those workers in those areas are really struggling and have had the hardest times, and are also facing the hardest times coming back. Quite a number of people who are, at least I would say, trepidatious about getting out and mingling with others. Now, there's another segment of our society that's acting like nothing's wrong. So it's kind of hit and miss, So it's not, you can't really say it's all one way or the other. So probably going to be a while for everything to recover.
I think you're right. It's not terribly surprising that perhaps the largest single group, right, of jobs lost was in the hospitality and leisure section, because those are those types of jobs that there isn't really a remote option for most of those jobs. You got to physically be there to do whatever that job is. And that's kind of something that I think we're going to talk more about in the second and third segment, is not all industries are experiencing this the same way. And I think it's really important that people keep that in mind, especially if you're one of those people that was laid off, as you're thinking about, where do I go back to work in? We've talked about, and I think a lot of other people have been discussing the possibility of this resurgence in cases and possibly some, limited shutdown again when things get bad. Nothing that anybody wants, but something that may very well be a reality. We have to think about, even if some of these people get hired back in the next few months, there's also the possibility they may lose their job again. So that understanding the different industries.
And there are job opportunities as well. I mean, that's the significant thing here. Not a lot of them, but, some people I'm sure have decided, I'm not going to wait for my old job when I can go out and get one, either as a delivery person or pulling orders or retail, working curbside delivery, whatever there is there. I'm sure many places have worked their staff in order to take some of those jobs. But at the same time, there are other people that are like, well, you know what? I'm healthy and I want to get out there and I think I can work.
There's been jobs, unlike a traditional recession, right? And what I mean by that is we're talking about like the 2008 financial crisis or the Great Depression, or some of the ones that happened throughout the rest of the 19th century. Those were not induced by necessarily a biological crisis like this. They were the result of our financial system doing what it does, expanding, contracting, risk-taking, too much risk, that sort of thing. And so this is very different in that there's a different reason that we entered this downturn. And so because everybody's staying at home, or many people were, you see that big increase in delivery. You create new jobs, new types of jobs. So I think that's important for people to understand too, is it's not just the jobs disappear like in a typical recession. There are new jobs in some cases being created, but those also might be temporary. So that's kind of the other. I'm sure that people will do more to take this philosophy in of, delivery and so forth. But at the same time, I'm sure you'll see a contraction in it once we get quote unquote back to normal, whenever that is. Some of those jobs will probably disappear again.
Well, and the question will be, how much of a contraction do we see? We've talked about on other shows, like we are in our household using the shopping part, when we're getting home delivery for groceries and we're going and pick things up in curbside. If those, how many people will continue to use that once this is over, just because they have kind of been forced into using it. You made that comment 3 or 4 shows ago, that and so what will happen? So there may be a huge contraction. Everybody just goes back to whatever that word normal is, and they all can, they all go away. Or we could see a resurgence, with this gig economy that we have, that people like this. They enjoy having this opportunity and they try some new things and they keep doing them, which then means the jobs will stick around. So that's another thing that would be interesting to see how this all plays out.
So coming up, we're going to talk to Robin Erikson, who's a researcher at the Conference Board and one of the authors of their most recent report, which they put together in record time and as a first of its kind report that discusses some of the potential long-term ramifications and also what employers are doing right now in the midst of COVID-19 and reopening. We're going to look at some things like an increase in remote work and how that could be perhaps one of the most influential legacies of COVID-19, and why some organizations are actually optimistic about their recovery from COVID. To find out the details on those, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The most recent jobs report from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics shows staggering numbers, some very concerning to many. We have a new report here from the Conference Board in New York entitled From Immediate Responses to Planning for the Reimagined Workplace. Joining us is Robin Erikson, a PhD and a principal researcher in human capital. She's written for the Wall Street Journal and Forbes.com and holds her PhD and MS from Northwestern University. Robin, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Justin. I'm thrilled to be back.
Looking forward to today's show and always enjoy discussing topics with Robin, and glad that you're here with us today.
Yeah, I think that's important to mention. Robin has joined us on the program, I think, a couple times before to talk about different things the Conference Board is doing. But today we get to speak with her about this new sort of one-of-a-kind survey that the Conference Board has done related to COVID-19. Robin, can you tell us a little bit more about what is this survey and who is it for in terms of what are you hoping that organizations out there might gain by having this at their fingertips?
Thanks, Justin. And it's probably more of a first of its kind survey. We here at the Conference Board, obviously, we cover many topics from politics to economics to human capital, and I'm in the human capital research group. We wanted to know how organizations were dealing with COVID-19. And so we did a survey, and we actually fielded the survey from April 15th to April 28th. So all of the data that I'm going to talk about is up through April 28th. But we had over 150 U.S. HR executives answering the survey, responding to the survey about what they're doing in terms of COVID at their organizations. And we had some interesting findings.
Now, are these respondents across various sectors, Robin? So we're not just talking about one particular type of industry, or is it more industry specific?
It is. It's actually across many sectors, and it's across organizations of different sizes. And we also looked particularly at two specific categories. The organizations made up of mostly industry and manual services. We had 38% responding, and we had 54% responding that are mostly professional and office workers. So I can mention that as well as we speak.
So it sounds like this is probably a pretty good cross-section of organizations. And one of the findings that caught our attention, more than 75% of organizations are expecting an increase in the number of employees working remotely for at least 3 days per week, even a full year after the pandemic is over and workers are permitted to return to physical workplaces. That's according to the report. Yet more than half of organizations expect their revenue to return to pre-COVID-19 levels within 12 months. So it's kind of this, you've got, we're going to be doing more remote work, we think permanently, or at least for a while, yet we're optimistic about revenue returning to pre-COVID-19 levels. So what's going on here with this mismatch? Is remote work something that we've just been moving towards and this is a good excuse to make it happen? Or is there something else driving this?
I think there's a couple things affecting this. And first of all, yes, we did have a little bit of optimism in the report findings. We were surprised to find out, like, as you said, more than half of the organizations expect their revenues to return to pre-COVID levels within 12 months. 36% expected it to return after that. So, I mean, and only 3% said that it wouldn't come back. But I do think that remote work, the technology is available and is out there, and that many companies had to adopt it very quickly, in some cases overnight. In fact, I remember here in Chicago, the day before the lockdown, we actually saw people walking to the train station carrying hard drives because their organization didn't have the infrastructure to send them home with laptops or set them up with an internal, with an internet cloud. But in our survey, we asked organizations, how many workers did you have before COVID and how many did you have afterward? And you can actually see that in that respondents, not very many people, not many of the organizations had that many people working at home before COVID-19. So less than 10% of the organizations we surveyed had 76% of their workers working remotely 3 days a week. So that's not very many, right? So less than 10% of the organizations we heard from said they had a majority of their employees actually working from home more than 3 days a week. But those numbers start to shift significantly when you look at after COVID. And after COVID, there's going to be many, many more workers working from home. And, even after 1 year after COVID. And we actually found that those organizations that had more remote workers before the pandemic actually self-reported an increase in productivity during the pandemic. So that was interesting to us because it makes sense, though, because those organizations that had many remote workers beforehand, they had the IT infrastructure to support working from home. They also, were able to quickly help their employees learn how to work remotely if they hadn't already. And that's a really big skill. And again, that's going to be primarily the organizations with office and professional workers that can work remotely. Obviously, for those organizations that are industry and manual services, not as many can work remotely. So there is a difference there.
So just a quick follow-up. Do you think that there is then an economic gain that companies are finding out, since they've kind of been, I don't want to say forced, but for everybody's protection to go this route, that they're finding out that their bottom line is increasing. And so that's going to motivate to keep it up? Or why do you think that we're going to see more of this?
I think that there's a few reasons for that as well. I think one of them is that organizations that have shied away from remote work in the past have actually seen that their productivity hasn't gone down that much by having remote work, especially for those organizations in that category of primarily office and professional workers. I'll give you an example. One very large financial services firm didn't like remote work. In fact, everyone was encouraged to work in the office, even when the offices were too small. So there wasn't enough parking. And so people had to take a shuttle bus that took up to 45 minutes. Once you got to the parking lot, you then had to take a shuttle to get to the office. So commuting was just really painful for many people. Interestingly enough, since COVID-19 happened, the employee engagement levels at this organization are higher than they've ever been before. In part because people aren't having to deal with the frustrations of a almost 2-hour commute each way. And they are learning how to work virtually and how to work effectively. So I think there's a lot of learning that's going to need to happen with that. But I've also heard some other organizations talk about how they don't want their employees to go back to the office until there's a vaccine. They don't want the risk. They don't want to have to compete for PPE with organizations that can't work remotely. So there's a lot of reasons, I think, that organizations all of them are considering it to some extent who should go back, when they should go back, how they should stagger that, what the office design needs to look like. But all of those things going together, we do believe that one of the most lasting legacies of COVID-19 here in the U.S. will be an increase in remote work.
Very interesting. So it sounds like most companies seem to be taking this reopening very seriously, trying to stagger things and wanting to wait till there's a vaccine. In the report, you mentioned that over 85% of the organizations are prioritizing workforce health and office safety. Even with these in place, though, did you get a feeling of, will the workers feel safe returning, or are companies kind of expecting a pushback? And you kind of answered that when you said maybe more remote work, but what about those in industry where they don't have that opportunity? What does the feeling seem to be, even though they're going to prioritize safety with how safe will the workers feel? And are the workers going to say, you know what, I'm not ready to come back yet? It's
really complex, isn't it? We don't know the exact answer to that. And I think it's going to be different for every organization, depending on their mix of workers, who can work from home, who can't work from home. There's a lot of actually employees who want to go back to the workplace because they miss the social interaction and the innovation and collaboration that comes from being together. Another issue is that most organizations haven't taught their employees how to work virtually. And so there's a lot of learning that needs to happen. And if you just think of one process, the talent acquisition process, to make it all, think of all the interviewing you're doing for hiring. If all of that has to become remote, there's a lot of changes just in terms of processes. But there are many places, though, where I think organizations are forcing employees to go back to work. As you were saying, that they don't have a choice. And in those cases, I think that there are workers who are trying to figure out, does that mean that they need to quit their jobs? Perhaps they're over 60 and know that they're at a higher risk, or they have one of the other high risk factors. Another issue is the lack of childcare that we've experienced in the last 3 months in elder care. There are many employees who have tried to be working full time, but at the same time, they're trying to take care of dependents full time. And so we've actually heard that there are many women who are deciding they can't work full time anymore. And it pains me because we've been fighting as a woman here, we've been fighting to get equal pay and to break through the glass ceiling. And the idea now that some of the women are going to have to leave the workforce is very sad to me personally.
Yeah, and like you said, Robin, it's certainly complex in that there's a lot of different effects as a result of this. And those effects are felt differently. And that's something that's kind of become apparent, at least to us since the pandemic erupted, is how these different areas of the country, whether it's like I have family in from out of town right now, from actually Chicago, how Illinois is dealing with things, how Chicago is dealing with things is different. And the rate of reopening is quite different than, say, Ohio, for example, or our cities in Ohio and smaller towns. And that speaks not only to obviously the areas of the country, but then also the industries in those respective areas. So how are they experiencing COVID-19 differently, the reopening process? And what's the long-term impact of that look like? Say, industries in Ohio get to reopen sooner. Does that put industries in someplace like Chicago behind the eight ball, so to speak?
Obviously it does, right? I think the lockdowns, you can even just look at Wisconsin and Illinois. I live in Chicago, and Wisconsin opened up much, much earlier than Chicago has been able to, than Illinois has been able to overall, but especially Chicago. And so there are incredible economic impacts. I think, again, the other big difference that comes down to whether or not organizations have primarily professional and office workers. Are they mostly those knowledge workers who can work remotely and continue to be productive? Mm-hmm. Or do they have mostly industry and manual services workers where, they have to be in the office? And for many of those businesses, they weren't considered essential and they had to close during the lockdowns. And so there are huge effects being felt, even in terms of the workforce cost reductions that are being taken. So I encourage you, if you're interested in those, to check out theconferenceboard.org. We have a section on COVID-19, and the actual survey is there for anyone who's interested in seeing it. And
these resources are free right now, right, Robin? I mean, related to COVID, anybody can go access this.
Correct. Anybody can access this. The actual report is called, I'll make sure I'll give you the exact report title. It's called From Immediate Responses to Planning for the Reimagined Workplace: Human Capital Responses to COVID-19.
It's interesting too, Robin, you mentioned, I was just thinking as you were sharing that answer about the difference between, those so-called white collar and blue collar workers. The other thing too, though, right, is that in the white collar space, there are some more opportunities to, even if people are returning to the physical workplace, it might be easier to take certain precautions in that setting, where in some blue collar professions, it's just not practical for them to carry out the job and still be able to social distance or wear certain types of PPE. But that's another way, right, that it's affecting it, even if they're both heading back.
So I actually think you're exactly right, Justin. And one of the things that organizations are doing is to stagger their workforces. They've gone from one shift to 3 shifts, right? So that they can have fewer employees at one time actually being in the workplace environment. Or they're going to have, half of their employees come back Monday, Wednesday, Friday one week, and Tuesday, Thursday the following week, and switch it the week after that. Because as you guys know, the trend in workplace design has been to have open floor plans. So what do you do now all of a sudden when you're supposed to have 6 feet between everyone, you've got to make sure that you take care of making sure, if social distancing is going to happen, you have to make sure that you do it appropriately.
Well, Robin, we really appreciate you taking some time to be on with us today, provide some of that insight. As you mentioned, for anybody, especially if you're in HR or company leadership, or maybe you just want some more information, the website there, the Conference Board website, great place to go. These reports are free right now, which is not typically how this works. So take advantage while you can of that. They put a lot of work into these and a lot of money and time. And they're all here as resources to make those informed decisions. So please be sure to check them out. Thank you again, Robin, for being on.
Thanks for having me.
If you'd like to view the report for yourself, as we've mentioned a few times, it is available complimentary to everybody right now. So we've got it linked at thestateofus.org. Of course, you can go to the Conference Board website and get it there as well. So be sure to check it out. Coming up, Lance and I are going to discuss what are the long-term ramifications. We've discussed a few of them here, but what do we think the ultimate impact will be, and what does it mean for you in your workplace? What can you do with this data that we've learned about in the first and second segments of today's show? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The April 2020 jobs report shows that there was a staggering loss of 20.5 million jobs, the largest monthly loss in recorded history. That's from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's what we talked about in the first segment of today's show. The second segment, we talked about some of the ramifications, and that was a report from the Conference Board in New York, a first-of-its-kind report, and we had the opportunity to speak with Robin Erikson, a researcher there, principal researcher at the Conference Board. Lance, here were my two biggest takeaways, right, from what we talked with about Robin, and you and I have looked through the full report. The positivity of companies, I thought, was an interesting one. They're very optimistic. Now, whether or not that's true, we don't know, but they're very optimistic that their revenue within 12 months is going to be back to where it was, or very similar. I guess I'm glad they have that optimism. I hope that's true. I hope that this isn't, that this isn't felt for a long time. But at the same time, history kind of tells us, right, that when you go into something like this, even if the actual event isn't very long, often it takes, in our economy, it takes at least a few years for that rebound to occur.
I just didn't think, and we talked about it for a little bit with Robin, in that, to me, it's almost like, well, yeah, my company's going to bounce back, but I wonder if they really feel like the entire economy is going to bounce back. I mean, I think that big you out there, you have to have confidence that your company is going to be okay, and that you can see things, half full instead of half empty, that there is room for growth and that you're going to pick up, and, you were doing well beforehand, so you think you're going to do well afterwards. But I just wonder if that number is as high when they start thinking about other people's businesses, because I think we sometimes tend to shed light that, we're going to be better off than the average person. And in this case, like you pointed out a couple different times, there's no guarantees. We haven't had this really before, in this huge of an economy. Yes, we can talk about, back in 1918 and whatever, but the United States wasn't in the same position globally that it's in now. So it's a little bit of a different animal here. And I don't think any of us can really know, just like we can't know about the spread of the virus or how dangerous it is. We all have our own opinion on that. I think it's wide open as to what happens here in the future with the economy. I think you can throw out the past and just say, yeah, well, we're going to establish some new history, if that's possible. That we're going to see how an economy this large and a worldwide economy comes back, and if it comes back that quickly, and how it comes back. And I'm sure there's going to be things there that we all, and even the economists, can't see, because it is the first time that we've really had to deal with something on this level.
The other takeaway that I thought was important, Lance, is the remote work component. Companies seem to feel that this will definitely increase their remote workforce. Now, I thought Robin did a good job of hopefully, and people caught this, I hope people caught this, making sure people understand that most companies don't offer a form of remote work, or if they do, it's such a tiny percentage of their workforce that saying there will be an increase does not correlate to most people working remotely. Okay. Which I think people could inadvertently assume if they don't really make sure they understand what was discovered by the report. So we want to make sure people understand that, yeah, they're projecting an increase based off of what these employers have told them, but you're not saying most workers, or really not even saying a quarter of workers are going to be working remotely. And I think a big part of that is part of what we've discovered, Lance. We've talked about the possibility of remote work for years is, yeah, there's people that do it, but it does take a very specific type of job, even in white collar jobs, for it to be practical to do it long term from afar. Aside from, and Robin, I think, mentioned this right, aside from that people like the collaborative environment, getting to see people in person, reading facial expressions in person is just not the same as it is over video. So while we've had remote workers for a long time, I think it's always occupied a smaller portion of the workforce, mainly because there's a practicality component to just what can be done from afar, even in quote unquote professional jobs / white collar jobs, those office type environments. So I think it's interesting that it'll increase, but at the same time, it's kind of what you and I talked about a while back, which is what I thought would be part of this is companies will discover that it's nice to say you're going to have people work from home, but not everybody has the quote unquote infrastructure they need to work from home. And I think that's part of what this has showed us is not everybody has. I mean, we went through that, right, Lance, with you and working remotely, is discovering that, yeah, this internet, it kind of can work, but if we're really going to do this long term, you have to spend money and upgrade it, right? Sort of thing. So I think that's something that people have to take into consideration and make sure they understand the ramifications of remote work. Sure, there's some benefits, but they also talked about, we didn't get to go on this very much, the downside for city centers, right? If we just pull back and remote work becomes the thing, you are talking about more job losses and business retraction as a result of less traffic in these downtown hubs where people go to work.
But I'm going to take a different view. I think you're exactly right. Nothing that you said there is incorrect, but you can also look at this as a huge experiment. This is something that we have talked about, and we have now gone through it, and we've worked out some of the kinks. We redid our internet connection and things like that. And, it works out that I'm paying, minimal, more each month. I'm paying less per month than I spend on gas coming to the studio every month, so I think if we look at this as a big experiment, we found out there are some things that work. Maybe and I would have been one that there was some pushback. Like, I don't want to work remotely, but there's been some positives to it. And I've learned some things and done some things, and I can see where there are parts of it that I like quite a bit. And I think companies are going to find that out. And Robin also mentioned that for those companies who had employees who had worked remotely before, actually saw an uptick in their productivity during this time, that since they already had the experience. So yeah, productivity went down because we were all learning how to do it. But now that many of us have added this to our job skill list, we maybe now can be a little more. I know that, I had to teach remotely, and going into it, if I were to have to do it to start next year, I'd be much better at it to start the year than I was when I had to pick up 3/4 of the year and learn something new. So I think I could be a much more effective educator. And just very quickly about your job component. Okay. But people are still going to have to eat lunch. People are still going to have to do those things that are in the city centers. We're just going to see a reallocation of money into other industries. So it might hurt that industry, but we will see maybe a growth in other industries as people stay home and work remotely. So I think there's a trade-off. It's just a new environment. It's just something that we're going to adjust. I mean, there used to be the Pony Express, right? Now there's email. Now there's Twitter. So we've gone through some of this before. And just because we lose it in one area Doesn't mean we don't pick it up in some area that we don't even know about yet to employ people. So I think we can't be, I'll be the positive one here, we can't be fearful of the future and what it might bring, because let's hope we learn from this and we can create some positives, and there'll be some positives on the other side of this. So that's the tack that I would take. Not necessarily disagreeing with what you said, but there's a different spin on it.
Right. Well, there's a lot of, I think that's part of what Robin hopefully highlighted for people too, is that there's a lot to take into account with everything that's going on, because we've been forced into looking at a lot of this. And we didn't even get to mention, because this isn't really part of what we were talking about today, but on that positive spin, one of those very unintended side effects that I think everybody can agree on is just a good thing. Whether or not you think climate change is a serious problem, we know there's been a massive decrease in emissions as a result of everything going on. And I think everybody likes cleaner air to breathe. So, I mean, you know, there's other things that are certainly advantageous to it. I think it is, experiment's a good word. It's a, you know, forced experiment, and it's going to, I think, let a lot of companies consider, maybe even if it's not fully remote, some more flexibility possibly with workers, saying, well, we don't need you here all the time, right? There are times where we want you to come in and we need you to be here, but maybe, you know, we don't need you every day of the week, or we don't need you for, you know, certain months of the year or what have you. You can do it remotely because what you're doing during that time's not as significant. So there's definitely
a lot of places are doing that 3-day on one week and then 2 days on the next week, and switching it up with different personnel. So and yet they're still considered full-time employees, because on the days they're not coming into work, they're still working remotely. So there's all kinds of possibilities, and this just opened up that opportunity for us, like you said, to experiment with it.
So there's a lot to think about here. Hopefully we've given you some useful information to think about what the long-term effects will be. And if you're a business owner, hopefully some items to take into consideration. Again, you can access these resources, thestateofus.org. They're linked there. You can also go to the respective parties' websites, the Conference Board and the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, for that information. Lance, we had this conversation today, right, in an effort to further our mission of hopefully making the world a little bit better place during all this hectic time and the foreseeable future. So what is that ultimate goal that we're working toward?
Well, we hope you enjoyed the show, because our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And I know that when I read this report, I was educated. So hopefully you'll go on, and since you have the opportunity to download it for free, which isn't normally the case with the Conference Board, take advantage of it and get out there and read it and see what they found out, and be able to make it applicable to your business or to your place of employment. And as well, make sure to get the word out and let people know that as a podcast, you can find us on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and anywhere else fine podcasts are found.
For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our guest, Robin Erikson, for being on today's show. And as always, a big thank you to our producer, Bradley Butch, for getting this together for us. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.